Professor Monica Duffy Toft, and dear participants, very good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. Welcome to NICE webinar on why is America addicted to foreign interventions. Nepal Institute for International Cooperation and Engagement is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank which believes in freedom, democracy, and world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. To talk on very interesting topic of today, we have Professor Monica Duffy Toft. Professor Monica Duffy Toft is a professor of international politics and director of the Center of Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Toft University. Before joining Fletcher, Professor Monica taught at Oxford University, Blavatnik School of Government, and Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government. While at Harvard, she directed the initiative on religion in international affairs and was the assistant director of the John M. Olin Institute of Strategic Studies. She was educated at the University of Chicago, master's and PhD in political science, and the University of California, Santa Barbara, where she held bachelor's in political science and Slavic language literature, summa cum laude. Prior to this, she spent 4 years in the United States Army as a Russian linguist. Monica's area of research include international security, ethnic and religious violence, civil war, and demography. Her most recent book includes Securing the Peace. It was published by Princeton in 2011. Political Demography, which was published by Oxford in 2012, and God's Century by Norton in 2012. In addition, she has published numerous scholarly articles and editorials on civil war, territory and nationalism, demography and religion in global politics. Monica can be found on Twitter at Monica Duffy Toft. Monica is also a research associate of the Helvetic School of Government at the University of Oxford and a Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center of Science and International Affairs. She is a supernumerary fellow at Brasenose College, University of Oxford, a global scholar of Peace Research Institute, Oslo, a member of the Council of Foreign Relations, the Minorities at Risk Advisory Board, and the Political Instability Task Force. In 2008, the Carnegie Foundation of New York named her a Carnegie Scholar for her research on religion and violence in 2012, and she was named a Fulbright Scholar, and most recently, she has served as a World Politics Fellow at Princeton University. Professor Toft, we welcome you again to our program. We'd like to request all our participants to drop their questions in the Facebook Live or in the Zoom chat box. Professor Toft, you will have around 30 to 35 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. This program is also broadcasted live on Facebook, and we'd like to request everyone to drop their questions on WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, wherever you feel comfortable. Please follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, and subscribe our NICE Nepal YouTube channel. Professor Toft, the floor is yours. Over to you, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really delighted. You know, Nepal is one of the countries I have not visited, so perhaps when the pandemic is over, I can come in person. But I have to say, having been on Zoom for a year now, it works well. And I think it's allowed for opportunities. Like I couldn't come to you right now because I'm in the midst of teaching. So I'm delighted to be here. And I actually think Zoom is a pretty effective platform, except that we don't get to meet in person. So thank you for having me. I'm delighted to accept the invitation. And today I'm going to be talking about a project. So I'm the director of the Strategic Studies Institute Center at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. And we've been working on this project for 3 years, and it's been sort of something I have been wanting to work on for quite some time in my research career. I've been an academic now for 2 decades, and I work on political violence, religion and identity and nationalism. As a cause of war, but then also as how it impacts the peace that happens once the violence has stopped. And, you know, when you're studying civil wars, you notice that many of them involve international actors and engagements. And in some cases, it's not for good. In some cases, it's for very good. They're trying to bring about peace, which is what your foundation is dedicated to studying. So this has also sort of been a hobby project of mine, is just sort of looking at the United States and its engagements. And so when I moved to the Fletcher School to Tufts University, I decided to start a major research project to actually investigate the US role in international affairs, and in particular its use of force, both for good. I think there are instances when the United States has brought about more stability and peace, but then also for ill, where it's been a destabilizing force. And what I was struck by is that there's good sort of analytical punch when you start making arguments. And right now in the United States, there's a big debate, especially now that we have a new president, President Joseph Biden, about whether the United States should and can be more restrained, or whether the United States should and can be more engaged. Under the Trump administration, there was a sense that he and his administration wanted to pull back from international affairs, wanted to go at it alone if it was involved at all, and not really pursue engagements multilaterally if they wanted to pursue engagements at all. In fact, Trump, President or candidate Trump ran on a policy of disengagement and pulling back and pulling US troops back, and actually sort of not weakening, but sort of asking NATO partners, which is the largest alliance that the United States is part of, asking NATO partners to pull more of their weight, to burden share a bit more. And so when I and my team started investigating exactly what is the US interventions, what has it looked like? And we were struck that there just really weren't good data to sort of adjudicate about whether the United States has been more engaged or more restrained. And if we want to be one or the other as a country, as a nation, as a citizen body, how do we become that? And so that sort of led to this project. And we've been working on it for 3 years. And I'm just going to run through it and run through some of the consequences and implications of it. And then I hope that we can set this up for a nice conversation as we get going. So I'm going to share my screen and then we can get going. So as you know, the big question is, and I've published a couple of articles about America's addiction to intervention. And I think when you see these data, you're going to understand why I'm less and less questioning that. When I started this, the question was, is America addicted to intervention? And now that we're on the final throw data, Oxford University Press next year, you'll see that question mark, I think we can suspend it and put a period at the end of it. So I'm going to just run through and go through the what of MIP. So what is the Military Intervention Project? That's what MIP stands for, the Military Intervention Project. Why are we doing it? And how are we doing it? And then round it out with sort of conclusions. And if you have questions, you can of course go into the chat box. But I think what we'll do is, given the nature of this forum, I'll hold back answering questions until the end of it. So the what, I've already sort of given you a sense of it. It's, sort of trying to look at every instance of US engagement internationally that involved the use of force. And what we're trying to do is do an extraordinarily thorough. So every instance that we have documented with at least 3 sources. All right, and we also are looking at every instance. Covert operations. Now, those are kind of difficult because when they're covert, they're in black budgets in the Defense Department. You don't see them, but many of it's been declassified, particularly since at least the 1980s or the 1970s. And so we actually do have fairly good data for a number of them. We're looking at the use and display of force and threats abroad. So what's different from our work is that we're not only look at actual instances when the United States, let's say, institutes a drone strike, but when it threatens to do that, right? And we also include drone strikes in our analysis. There's different data sets, and many people have a data set on drone strikes, and they don't include it in a use of force data set or an intervention. We include them because we do think that that's the deployment of American resources overseas to try to achieve its political objectives. We're also looking at the costs. And when I say costs, and I think you'll appreciate this because you're an institute, you're committed to peace, costs come away, right? There's obviously also the economic costs, but then also in looking at different periodization, different time periods, and some their immediate costs, again, loss of life, destruction of property. But then over the longer term, looking at sort of the democratization efforts of the country in which the United States is intervening, or looking at the impact of our soldiers, right? So we talked today a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and so we're trying to encapsulate that as well to try to get a sense of you know, the harm, the impact on U.S. troops, but then of course on societies in which we're intervening. We codify over 200 different factors and their consequences. And then importantly, what really distinguishes us, we have case narratives for every instance of the use of force with sourcing. So when we went to other data sets, there really wasn't. The core question is what costs and or benefits does America's increasing reliance on its military power offer as a foreign policy choice? And what we're doing is testing a hypothesis, which I've labeled elsewhere in my publications. And if you want, I can share them with the Institute and you can put them up, is the kinetic diplomacy hypothesis, which is basically that the United States is supplanting more traditional or other forms of statecraft for the use of force. And those other forms, the obvious two, are economic trade and tradecraft, and then of course diplomacy. And so we're looking at the consequences of this balance, or what we would call an imbalance. And you can see there are a couple of quotes underneath my slide here. General Mattis, who was a formidable military officer who became the Secretary of Defense, our National Security Advisor, said, if you don't, because he understood that diplomacy, you want diplomacy first, use of force second. So why MIP? I think I've already alluded to it. When you look at U.S. history, the U.S. has traditionally had sort of grand strategic goals. And if you think about its history from 1776, when the country was founded, you could even argue earlier, 1776 just sort of codified its independence from Great Britain. But then it turned to conquering the great frontier. And here you can think about Manifest Destiny, sort of expanding American power from the eastern seaboard, the 13 colonies west, and then also out into the Caribbean, then of course into the Philippines, into the Pacific Ocean. And so thinking about the sort of conquering the great frontier, first against the American Indians, but then native indigenous populations. Those were foreign interventions. The native tribes here, the native indigenous populations, the United States recognized them as foreign actors, and we had treaties and obligations to them, but we abrogated those as part of our trying to conquer the great frontier, Manifest Destiny, and to some extent the white man's burden, which drove some of this. And then World War II, the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, where you started seeing hostilities and sort of great power machinations between the Europeans, and in particular, the rise of Germany and France, and then competition with Great Britain, which were sort of jostling for power within Europe. But as we know, the Great Game and sort of the imperial conquest of Africa and other parts of the world, including in Asia, to try to consolidate their power. And it sort of culminated in World War I. And that's when the United States sort of started entering the international stage beyond sort of the continental Union. The second part of World War I was World War II, and the United States committed to defeating the Axis powers, in particular Germany and Italy, and then Japan, to help its allies, France and Britain, to sort of stave off fascism and authoritarianism in Europe. And then with the Cold War and the confrontation with the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc was trying to prevent World War III, and in particular, a nuclear holocaust from 1945 through to about 1989 to 1991, depending upon when you end the Cold War. And then after 91 was leading a new world order, and the United States sort of emerged triumphant with its allies, right? And trying to sort of lead a new world order toward a more liberal democratic peace. Now, there were some perturbations in that. We can talk about Rwanda and Somalia, which were horrific, but there were also, other crises around the world. But generally speaking, no power competition. The Russian Federation wasn't the peer competitor that the Soviet Union had been. And of course, China hadn't been as formidable as it is today, although it's still very well debated about whether China is a peer competitor today. There's a sense that it may be, it could potentially be, but it's not yet. but also now Russia is sort of seen as an adversary of the United States. And so we've moved into a period, and it's nuclear armed, and it's still a formidable country, and it's vast. And that we could potentially get there again, but we don't know. So the 1990s into the early 2000s, the United States was hegemonic, and there was sort of an effort to lead a new world order. Now, whether you agreed with that, like that new world order, China and the rest of the Federation did not. That was what the positioning was, and the United States saw itself until 9/11. And 9/11 was when the American heartland was attacked, and we lost thousands. And the idea there was that we needed to prevent that from happening again. And of course, we went into Afghanistan, and we're still there. But then Afghanistan, we had under President George Bush, Jr., George W. Bush, decided to also go into Iraq. And made at one point it was supposed to be about nuclear weapons, and then it was a humanitarian issue, and then of course it became part of the global war on terror, which is what GWAT stands for. And we're still fighting that war today, both in Afghanistan and Iraq, as you know, is not completely pacified. And we have Syria, and then of course Yemen, and current President Biden is trying to disengage the United States from Yemen and trying to work through Afghanistan. So the big question today, as we're sitting here as scholars, as analysts, as people interested in global politics, is what is the United States' strategic goals now? What is it trying to achieve? And we saw that under President Trump, it was sort of disengagement. It was going to engage either unilaterally or bilaterally. That multilateralism was sort of going to go by the wayside. And so the big question there is where does America's use of force and military power, which is quite formidable still, the United States spends 10 times more than the next, it spends more than the next 10 nations below it in terms of military defense spending. So where is the United States going today, and what is the use of force? And so this, the argument that I've put in some writings is, the United States has, its current strategy is one hammer, right, but many nails, right? We don't have sort of adversaries everywhere. We have some adversaries, but the question is, even against adversaries, should we be using the use of force? And my sense is looking at history is it's been a whack-a-mole policy. In the United States, we have this circus games where little creatures pop up at a circus and a big hammer and try to keep them at bay. And the United States, why I call it a whack-a-mole policy, is that we've been more reactionary. We haven't been out front thinking and working with other states so that we don't want to, so that we don't become put in a position where we have to use force. And this yellow pad is quite famous. What it was John Bolton, who was the national security chief for President Trump, when Venezuela really became quite worrisome, even more worrisome than it is today in terms of the flow of refugees and populations and potential violence. And the Trump administration was trying to figure out what to do. And on the yellow pad, Bolton's yellow pad is, let's send troops to neighboring Colombia. So, the instantaneous response is, no, let's work with, diplomats down there and find out if we can find sort of a non-lethal force, use of force. So what's interesting about this is that if you think about the United States as a great power, you think about it as formidable and having the capacity to deploy force around the world, and nobody denies that, is that some policymakers in Washington, scholars are aware of this, but policymakers in Washington are not aware that should the United States use to deploy force, its chances of prevailing have diminished substantially over time. So this is showing you that whereas in the 19th century, you can see here from 1800 to 1849, when a great power, so we're talking a power differential of 10 to 1, right? So this is an index of economic might and population size. When a great power, a major power, went up against a smaller power, its chances of prevailing was 88%. So almost pretty good odds. But that starts diminishing over time, so that when you get to the 1950s, and the reason for that is that military power has changed, military might, and what it means to be strong has changed. And the big thing that has changed is that strategies, that smaller states, smaller powers, insurgencies even, have learned how to fight guerrilla strategies really, really well, such that great powers and major powers have not been able to win. And you could think about Afghanistan as the longest running engagement the United States has ever been involved in. And guess what? In Afghanistan, the Soviet Union, a nuclear armed Soviet Union in the 1970s and 80s, was also defeated. Vietnam, the United States, there wasn't a warning call to the United States that we couldn't prevail against a smaller power. And this has been a part of a trend. So what's mysterious here is these data are out there. This is a book that was published in 2000, and I think this one was published in 2005. The data were released in 2001. And policymakers aware of this. Why is so much hubris? It's the idea that, oh, we'll be the exceptional ones, that we'll be able to prevail. Yet, as we know, in Afghanistan, this is not happening. So it's sort of a mystery as to why we still are getting involved in these engagements in smaller states or in these, intractable conflicts, and not listening to our own history and to the history of other great powers. And if you look at the US budget, this is our defense budget relative to our State Department budget. So this is the State Department budget here. You can see that the US defense budget, it's up now over $700 billion. It's kind of nuts, right? I think it's 17% of it goes to personnel, in part because we've been involved in so many engagements. And so it's a cumulative effect as they have more troops and soldiers involved in material. So it's been building over by President Eisenhower in his farewell address, that the United States has to be very wary of becoming too formidable and allowing for its military might to be the face of American power. And my fear is that's where we're at. And I should mention that Department of State funding has never gone over 5.5% of Department of Defense funding. Just imagine what you could do if the Department of State funding was at least half or even just double of what it is today. So the other interesting thing is that most Americans don't even really see when we get involved. So right now, I think if you asked what's the biggest threats to the United States in the White House, particularly in the Trump administration, but then also I think coming into the Biden administration, they would have said, probably Iran, followed secondly by North Korea. Not necessarily in the military level. But if you ask Americans, what one country anywhere in the world do you consider as greatest enemy, it's Russia, followed by China, then North Korea and Iran. And why this matters is because if you think about the global war on terror and where most of the funding, a lot of the funding, not most, but a lot of the funding is going to, it's actually on Afghanistan and Iraq. So most everyday Americans actually do not recognize or don't accept that where most of this funding is going to is not to defeat Russia per se or China per se, but actually going to Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's again a paradoxical situation. Moreover, the strategy of the last decade, you could say the last 20 years, Americans are not satisfied with the American positioning in the world. It's dropped precipitously. And you can see that there was a peak here. This is 9/11, sort of a rally around the flag effect when the United States came to Afghanistan to try to rat out Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. But then it dropped off pretty precipitously. And the reason is Americans thought, we're not actually more secure. We don't feel more secure. Maybe this is not the way that the United States should present itself. And it's, by the way, it's not just Americans. If you look around, this is looking around the world of 30 different nations, populations within 30 nations, you can see from 2013 to 2017 in a 4-year period. Think about it, this is just a 4-year period. The United States, and this is my nation, my country, is now seen as a major threat around the world to other populations. And that's pretty distressing when you think about it. So the question is the United States getting what it wants? So the imperative of kinetic diplomacy, the argument is that the US has devolved into some allies. And yes, we are committed to defending our allies, but we're also acting outside of alliances and that alliance behavior. And you know, a bully, if you check Merriam-Webster dictionary in English, you know, it's defined as someone who aims to intimidate or harm those it perceives as vulnerable. And one of the arguments that we're making for why the United States has done this is that we've just so diminished the role of the Department of State. And part of that, so an evidence of that, an indicator of that is that you can look at the rise of political appointees. So in the United States, whenever there's a new government, it's an astonishing transformation. You have sort of a mix of committed public civil servants. These are bureaucrats, people who have been in their jobs for decades. They're committed to helping the nation to more effectively govern itself. But then each administration has the capacity to bring in political appointees. So they curry favor, or they met somebody in graduate school or in law school, or they want to do them a favor and they want an ally, right? If they want policies passed or implemented. So they can appoint politically people who they want. So the US government is a mix of political appointees and sort of committed civil servants, right? Professional civil servants. And if you look at the Department of State, you know, 45% of the appointees in the Department of State were political appointees under President Trump. Whereas if you look under Obama, George W. Bush, and under Clinton, it was just a third, right? So only about a third of them. And then particularly, this is looking at ambassadorships. And why that's an issue is that these people may not speak the language of the country in which they're serving, right? They're business people, right? They run companies, or they're journalists, or they're just incredibly wealthy people who have a business somewhere in, I don't know, Texas or the Dakotas, and they're not experts in Denmark, right? But the point is policy. And so the Department of State doesn't have, or didn't under President Trump, will watch under President Biden, the proportion here. I suspect he's going to try to get it down to that norm of a third. But I would say that the Trump administration was just sort of a process that's been taking on over the decades of more political appointees, less expertise, and has harmed US policy. And I think that that's sort of helped to contribute to the rise in the number and intensity of military interventions over time. Let's go to the next slide. So the approach, so what we're doing is, you know, the book that we have, and we have an article under review, and anybody would be willing to share it with anybody. And like I said, I have pieces published on this, which is I think how you found me, Dr. Jaiswal, is that we're providing a concise synthesis of the entire arc of US foreign policy and intervention since 1776. It's a broad sweep, it's hundreds of years. And we're comparing contemporary US foreign policy historical narratives and personalities. Some personalities are stronger. President Trump was a hands-on person. He tended to do things personalistically and more independently, whereas other presidents relied on their bureaucracy. So then the grand strategy analysis, looking at that for each period to see about that. And like I said, it's a data-driven project because we feel like data are incredibly important. And what we're trying to do is sort of develop a US foreign policy toolkit that includes war. We understand that the resort to force is very important, but then also thinking about diplomacy and trade, or the trade-off between soft power and hard power tools. So current perception of the US as a bully arises from its trigger-happy foreign policy. I'm going to show you the data in a second. And there's been minimal support within some administrations for diplomatic efforts. And like I said, few consistent national strategies. And the interventions have increased over time, and the nature of them shifted, and their purpose has evolved. And so let's take a look at the data. So how are we doing this? So the numbers, so there's been close to 500 military involvements in the US founding in 1776. And by the way, these data that I'm sharing with you now, these have all been verified. There's even more, because we've already codified from 2017 to 2020. And so we have even more than that. Between 1945 and 2017, the US has intervened 250 times. So just in that one time slice in the post-Cold War period and the Cold War period, over half of them. In the post-Cold War period, almost a quarter of them, and 71 interventions in 17 years after 2000. And in the Middle East, the United States really likes the Middle East right now. If you look at other data collection efforts, Congressional Research Services is the government body that tracks data. It's a great data set. We used it to start our analysis, and we worked and talked with them about it, but nothing is sourced, right? So as scholars, there's no resources to verify why a given event was included in the data set. And honestly, you can go and look at it, each one of them is one line. So it's just saying, engagement in Yemen, part of GWAT. Without explaining what was involved, what were the consequences of a given conflict. And we have all of that now. So our main empirical contributions, so what are we doing is we're expanding the timeline. Many data sets don't go as far back. We're using several definitions of intervention, so including the display and the threat of the use of force, which is really important because then you can look at the escalation of the violence, right? So did it dissipate? Did the violence, our threat of the use of force lead to the other side is stepping back? Did it lead to an escalation that we got a fully throated war? And then we're comparing across different databases to see if we can verify other scholars' findings. And importantly, we're looking at both the short-term costs, like I said, number of people who were harmed or killed on the battlefield, to the longer-term costs, looking at the levels of democratization in the country, the target country, and or their economic capability. We also measure drone strikes and covert special forces operations, which others do not. And then we have, like I said, these historical case studies over time. So if you look at US interventions by regions, this is just the whole entire sweep of time. You can see that Latin America and the Caribbean have involved about a third of the engagements. And that makes sense. This is the America's sphere of influence. If you think about back to the 18th and 19th century, I already talked about trying to sort of get control of what it saw as its area of operations, right? But then it shifts. But you can also see that Europe and Central Asia for a period involved, and you could think about World War I and World War II, but then also lesser engagements. The United States did and was part of interventions in Russia during the Russian Revolution. And then the Middle East and North Africa, about 15%, and then East Asia and the Pacific, about 21%. So over time, the United States has been pretty far and wide engaged around the world, but it's shifted. And the next slide is going to show you that there's been a warping and waning. And you can see in the early part of the country's founding, that we pretty much liked. This is the aqua, Latin America and the Caribbean. But then we start seeing East Asia and the Pacific really picking up, which is your region of the world. And then we start moving into the today. And although under the President Biden, he'd love to get out of Yemen, but what's going to happen in Syria and what's going to happen in Iraq, we don't know yet. So like I said, what's unique to our project is we moved from no hostility levels, right? So it's just normal diplomatic relations all the way on up to interstate war and fully throated engagement with international actors. So if you look at the dyadic, so this is sort of, this next slide is looking at the levels of hostility between the United States and the country in which it engages. And you can see the vast majority is the uses of force. And actually the one that's the least is interstate war. So the United States hasn't been involved in a lot of fully scaled interstate wars, conflict between two states, but it has been involved in a lot of usage of war. States did quite a bit in the early part of the 19th century, where it would send a ship to the waters that in borders with Canada, but also the display of the use of force. Send a carrier group somewhere to say, look, if you push this, then we're gonna have to resort to conflict. And you see this today in the South China Sea, where it sends carrier groups, and also in the Red Sea area around Iran and Yemen, where the United States is displaying force as a way to be more threatening, to get the other side to back down. But the vast majority, as you can see, is actually the usage of force, and that has been the case more so over time. And as a result of that, so I already showed you this slide here, that it goes from not even a display of force all the way to interstate war. So you see how it goes from you can see over time, this is, looking over time in the early part of the country from 1776 to 1812, it was actually very, very little engagement. I mean, the United States was defending back and pushing back, but it wasn't using force. It was using threat of the force or display of force. And this continued, right? So you see the orange. Now, World War I and World War II, you can understand why this is a bit redder. The United States was deeply engaged in both of those wars in Europe and then in Asia. But then during the Cold War, there was a cold peace where the United States sort of kept at bay. Yes, we were involved, but we didn't want to get too involved in a number of places because we were worried about the Soviet Union and its sort of counter-reaction. But by the end of the Cold War and the start of the post-Cold War period, you can see that the United States hostility levels have become quite grave, and particularly after 2001 with the global war on terror, where there's really no other state to say to the United States, maybe it was seen by the international community as within its rights. It had been attacked. But the question is did it take it too far? And our argument is obviously, if you look at the numbers, we've taken it too far. And you can see at the bottom the different levels and the different areas in which the United States, in the notes, it might do. All the way, there's 24 different levels from no uses of force all the way down to the use of chemical, biological, or radiological weapons. And fortunately, we haven't used chemical, biological, radiological weapons since World War II. So this next slide is really, really important because what it's showing you about this 2001 and 2017 period, our most recent period, is that, yes, the United States has a right to defend itself. It was attacked after 9/11. Our countrymen were killed, right? We had a right to go after Afghanistan because it was harboring terrorists who wanted to harm us. Is continuing to escalate at a time when our opponents are de-escalating. So that's what this slide is showing you. So if you look at the United States and its activity, it's been creeping up, right? This is an upward slope, right? This is obviously World War I and World War II, but it's been creeping up over time such that, we're at our highest point. But at the same time, if you look at what our adversaries, so when we go and we say, all right, we're either going to use force, display force, or threat force, or maybe go to war, they've been de-escalating. So at a time when we're escalating as a country, they're de-escalating. And this is where we get the idea that the United States is a bully. It's intimidating. And I already showed you data about sort of asymmetrical power. Even when you're doing that, you're less likely to win. You're more likely to lose. This is the theoretical contributions, and that's the data. So the data are a bit worrisome. I'm an American citizen, I'm a U.S. Army veteran. I'm unnerved by these data. The United States needs to think a little bit more practically and smartly about its use of force. So if you look at the debates in the United States, and you can read them in newspapers, and then of course in academic and in more mainstream journals, there's a real debate about realists versus liberals. And so it's sort of material power, capability and might versus rights and values, democracy and liberalism, right? A real debate in academic literature and in policy circles. But in policy circles, it's about restraint versus engagement. Should the United States be a more restrained power, right? Or should it be more engaged? And there's arguments on both sides. It should be more restrained because the United States creates more problems than it ameliorates. And it's not actually defending and securing its own national interests. But on the engager side, they say, no, when the United States pulls back, that the world sort of more instability happens, right? In the Middle East, in Latin America, in Asia, that the United States needs to stay engaged. Well, what's striking is that our data actually can now adjudicate whether that's the case. When the United States is more engaged, particularly with the threat or the use of force, is it making the world more secure and stable, or is it making less so? And I suspect, we're still working on that analysis, is that it's mixed, right? That the United States needs to be smarter, because in some cases it actually makes the country or the region in which it's engaging more stable, but in other instances, actually it makes it less stable. The other thing that we can do is we're looking at interventions, types of interventions. Is it better for the United States to go alone? The United States has that capacity. It's one of the few nations in the world that can actually engage on its own. It has lift capacity, it has the aircraft, and it has the personnel. It's a large country. Marines, Navy, and Coast Guard. And so we can adjudicate that. And then we can look at over time, right, how successful we are at time, both in the short term, but then also in the longer term. So if you look at the US national interests and power, right, so here what I'm trying to get at is when the United States engages, right, is it engaging for vital national interests? And you can see indeed that during the Cold War, there was no denying it. We were concerned about the Soviet Union. We were concerned about the communist red bloc. But by the 1990s to the 2000s, the Soviet Union's gone. And if you look at where the United States was engaging, the power, right, the power structure between it and the state upon which it was intervening, you cannot make the argument that vital national interests were at stake, which is kind of sad because it makes you feel your forces in order to try to secure those interests. So here, if you look at the different, this is just sort of numerically what's behind that last chart. From 1776 to 1864, our national index was 1.16. We had high national interest. We had 77 interventions, but we were incredibly weak. By the most recent period, which is the one we're most secured, where our national interest index is low, but we are really, really powerful relative to other states, right? Yet we still are getting involved in the use of force. So if you look at the objectives for US intervention, you can see the period from 2001 to 2003. That's this period here. Compared to what to achieve over time. And if you look at the types of interventions, the United States has become more unilateral, not exclusively. I'm going to show you a thing that we still do work with allies, but in the most recent period, it's been a little bit more unilateral. There's some multilateral in there, and then for some, it's not clear. But over time, the United States has become more unilateral. There's some exceptions, and I'll show you some data in a second. And here, in the post-Cold War environment, under George W. Bush, 51% of our engagements did involve allies. And here you can think about Afghanistan to some extent, but then also Syria, Libya, Mali, that the United States was trying to get engaged with its allies. So even though still operating in some multilateral operations, in fact, more so if you look at the total numbers over time. And here, during the Cold War, NATO was never deployed, right? You think about that, it worked. It was a cold peace, right? All of them happened in the post-Cold War period. And you can see these are the main operations that happen. And they don't include the air patrols by NATO in Iraq over 1991 or any training missions in Iraq and Africa. And this is a good, this is sort of trying to highlight a good thing that the United States still is engaged with allies. Nevertheless, we do have a fairly large number of operations. And the other interesting thing about operations with our allies is they tend to be longer in duration, but they tend not to be less deadly. And they're less likely for protection of US military and diplomatic assets, which makes sense. So I showed you that the number of unilateral those tend to be to try and secure and rescue diplomatic assets. And when we involve and are engaged with allies, they tend to be for humanitarian objectives, which is good, right? Because we're trying to protect lives, trying to protect values. But the question is can the United States, stay that way and or operate that way and not be so unilateral? And so the big question is what's going to happen to the United States as we move forward, and particularly under the new president. He does seem more likely to engage internationally, and we believe, if we follow his rhetoric, engage multilaterally. So what are our main policy contributions? So what we're trying to do is guide policy debates based on factual evidence. Like, there are really good arguments on both sides, and like I said to you earlier, I fundamentally believe, actually, that in some cases, under some instances, that you should be restrained. question is, how should you be in both? If you're restrained, is it better to be unilateral? You get to act quicker. You get to really demonstrate that it's U.S. vital interests, so your reputation is better. Or should the United States be more restrained? And then we can actually do an evaluation of our different operations to see if they've succeeded. We've been presenting our research. I'm presenting it to you here, both in the United States, but then overseas, and also to congressional leaders and to policymakers, and writing op-eds, opinion editorials in a number of outlets to try to make American citizens and the general public aware of these dynamics. Because these are US tax dollars, right, that are going places, and we want to make sure that Americans are fully cognizant. More immediately, current politics have led to an inversion of our hard-won lessons. I've already showed you those data that show that great powers are losing conflicts more and more over time. Intervene. And I know that you had Joseph Nye, who was a colleague of mine at the Kennedy School here, talking about soft power. I'm sure you talked about soft power and military statesmanship and leadership, his most recent book, but really sort of thinking about diplomacy and reinvigorating diplomacy. I'm at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We have trained some of the world's best diplomats. And so pushing this idea and trying to move away from military might. And in the United States, we have this term called DIME, for standing for diplomacy, intelligence, military, and economic, and really putting that forward with the idea that diplomacy should be first. So the next steps were, if anybody's interested in these data, I don't know if there's any students online or scholars online. We're finishing our case histories. We're publishing an article. We have a book coming out. And we're going to be starting phase 2 of our project. If anybody wants to collaborate, if knows the data set, we're on all states and their intervention strategies, and we're calling Comparative Military Intervention Project. And then lastly, we're going to be looking at exit strategies. So once a state gets involved in an intervention, and very little has been written systematically about exit strategies as the United States is trying to figure out, how do we move out of Afghanistan? How do we disengage from Yemen? What's going to happen in Iraq and Syria? So I'm going to end it there, and I welcome your questions. I'm just going to put up one slide just to give a sense, and I think you'll appreciate this. This is coming out of the project out of Brown University, and questioning what should US national spending priorities be. And you can see that for every increase in spending, the one that gets the most punchback is elementary and secondary schools. So every $1 million you spend, you get 19 elementary and secondary school professional defense sector jobs. So even thinking on the employment level, in terms of defense spending, it would be much wiser, assuming that this is enough, that we have enough defense spending, that we could really improve and increase different policy areas if we just scaled back our defense spending a little bit. So I'll end it there, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Professor Monica Toft. Thank you very much for the interesting, enlightening, and very comprehensive presentation. We learned a lot. We'd like to thank you for your time. We have received lots of questions. Around 25 questions has already popped in. So without wasting any time, let me move to the questions. The first question is it natural for great powers to intervene abroad to serve its national interest, or it is just with the United States? Are there any other great powers in the past intervened like the United States? If not, what are the reason behind it?
And no, it's not unique to the United States. So if you think about the 18th, they asked about in the past, the 18th, you could go back to the 16th and 17th centuries. I mean, the Spanish Empire, those were interventions and those were occupations of states, right? So no, this is not just a bailiwick of the United States. It's just that in the contemporary era, the United States is a pretty formidable power. And that it has the capacity. So the imperial struggle, with the Europeans sort of trying to go and occupy the globe, where Great Britain ended up occupying 1/7 of the Earth's land masses. So there are other states that have done that. Germany too. Germany was sort of left behind. It did some engagements in Africa in the 19th century, but no, this is not just for the United States. And even today, you think about the Russian Federation moving into Ukraine, right? Use of force, right? Now, Russia concerned about maintaining a toehold in Syria. It has a base there, and would like to maintain some semblance. The big concern today, and one of the big question marks, is China. Right, is how interventionist is China. And interestingly, China has made it very, very clear in terms of its foreign policy that it believes in the sacred sovereignty of states, meaning that it does not believe that it should get involved for human rights issues and intervene over human rights issues. That really distinguishes it from the United States. So one of the things that makes the United States unique is it does tend to intervene for humanitarian affairs or humanitarian issues, whereas other states like the Russian Federation and China do not. I say that, and I want to temper it a little bit, because actually US allies, Britain and France, Germany less so, but Britain and France, if there's a population suffering, that they would support an intervention. Remember, it was France that dragged, or not dragged, but really pressed the Obama administration to get involved in Libya. And the argument for going to Libya was imminent distress of a population, fear of genocide or politicide against the population. And then similarly in Mali, Mali's a little bit more complicated case because you had an insurgency there fighting with the government. But there was deep concerns about the humanitarian issues. So the United States is not, what makes the what makes it unique is not its inclination to do this. There are other states, France and Great Britain in particular, but its capacity to do so, right? So those states are willing to, and its willingness to do so for not only material reasons, but also humanitarian interests. So, and we can document that, and we've been documenting that in our,
Thank you, Professor. We have the next question. It is often seen that Republican government has been more aggressive, but the previous president, Donald Trump, did not intervene in any countries. What are the reasons behind it? How do you look at Biden administration in relation to interventions abroad?
That's a great question. And there is, it's so funny because there does seem to be this conventional wisdom or common wisdom out there that Republican presidents or Republican administrations are more war prone. And actually our data don't show that. They show that it's kind of neutral who the president is. And I think why we believe that today is that George W. Bush getting the United States involved in that long engagement, both in Iraq and Afghanistan. But most people believe, policymakers and scholars believe, that had it been a Democratic president, he or she might have also gotten involved in Afghanistan. With Afghanistan, the Iraq situation, I would call it the Iraq fiasco or chaotic situation. But when you look at the data, actually it tilts a little bit more Democratic. And the reason for that actually goes back to the first person's question about inclinations. Republicans tend to be actually strong military and a bit more isolationist, right? They don't want, they're more, if you look at historically, Republican administrations are less willing to use force. And like I said, this tendency to be a little bit more isolationist and recognize that force may not resolve the issues. And also the use of force for national interests. Whereas Democrats, they tend to think about the individual and human rights more. It's part of the makeup of the party, right? Recognizing identities and values and individual liberties based on the individual, and that needs to be protected. You can do more humanitarian conflicts, right? To get involved in more humanitarian concerns. And our data, it's not strong, but our data seem to support that idea that the democratic institutions, they do become more engaged. And here, that really came out during the Clinton administration in the 1990s, where the United States was really a dominant power, hegemonic, right? The Soviet Union was gone. The Russian Federation was sort of, struggling to get its bearing. And you had fights between the Department of Defense and the Department of State, and under Colin Powell, and then later under others, where the Department of Defense said, no, we don't want to get involved, and the Department of State saying, absolutely, this is what the military is for. And you had that sort of that tension there. And so democratic administrations, because they have national interests than the Republican administrations, the evidence seems to indicate otherwise. Now, President Trump, you're absolutely right. He came in with an America first, and we're going to pull back. And he is the first president since Clinton, I think, that has not started an international engagement. The problem with the argument is, first, actually, the number of drone strikes under the Trump administration and the use of force actually increased. So yes, he didn't start any new engagements, but he intensified existing ones. And you can think about Yemen, which is why President Biden now is saying we want to pull back from Yemen. So he intensified existing ones. Yes, he was trying to pull back from Afghanistan, but that was already happening, and similarly in Iraq. So it's not clear. So the rhetoric actually doesn't match the policy reality that we actually witnessed under the Trump administration. And you could make the argument, and we still don't know, it's because didn't allow him, or it was purely rhetoric and the Trump administration didn't push hard enough. But in any event, it's sort of not true that the Trump administration, it's true that they didn't start any new engagements, but it's not true that they were not an interventionist administration. They actually were, if you look at the number of engagements and the level of engagements under the administration.
Thank you, Professor. We have a very interesting question, and we're trying to club other questions as well.
Sure, you maybe ask a couple at once, and then I can respond to them.
One is, how do US create enemies, motivations, and domestic consent for foreign interventions? Another question is, what went wrong during the Vietnam War that people in the United States protested against US government and asked for the end of the war?
Okay, that was a great question. Yep, and they're kind of related. So national security, and the sad truth for me as a scholar is most Americans don't care about foreign policy. It's about their pocketbook, whether they have food on the table, a roof over their head. So foreign policy, to a large extent, is left to elites to sort of adjudicate and debate. And so long as Americans don't feel it personally, they're not going to sort of engage on issues of foreign policy. 9/11 changed that a little bit. The global war on terror, America was attacked, right? We hadn't been attacked since, Hawaii, since World War II and the Japanese in Hawaii. So 9/11 changed that a little bit, but then, we're now 20 years past, or 19 years past 9/11. And so sort of foreign policy has been pushed to the side. And interestingly, that if you look at how the global war on terror has been budgeted, Americans aren't seeing to my children, my grandchildren, trillions of dollars in this. And so in the old days, they'd feel it in taxes, right? You would have to, a president and administration would have to raise taxes to pay for these wars. So Americans are not feeling the brunt, the fiscal brunt. And then if you think about the casualties relative to the broader population, they're very small, they're very low. We've gotten very, very effective in fighting wars and not having a number of American casualties. Drone warfare, these men and women are sitting on a tarmac in Arizona or Nevada, right? They're not in harm's way, right? And so the American population is not feeling the impact either financially or personally in terms of casualties. And related to that is fewer and fewer Americans serve in the military. You look at our Congress today, Obama didn't have military service. This is 2 presidents in a row that have not had military service, but they're indicative of the broader United States, where the military has been left to others. So you have a disinterested population, generally of foreign policy and national security policy. And then you have wars that aren't being taxed and paid for in the normal sense, and a population itself that's serving less and less over time. So this is why they sort of extend out. And in terms of the wars in Vietnam, it wasn't the same situation. American population, it was palpable to them. 50,000 Americans died. And it was just a matter of time during this escalation where they started feeling it and the brunt of it. And also, don't forget, it was happening at a time where TVs now were becoming, part and parcel of the American dinner table. People were watching TV over dinner now. and seeing these extraordinarily visceral images. And so there was a distrust of government. There was distrust, and watching these images across. And remember, we had the civil rights movement in the late 60s where people were taking to the streets. And so this became another issue about which people rallied around. And they did not want the United States to be representative of a country that was beating up on a little guy. It just didn't comport with American values. It was a very different period in the late 60s, early 70s than what we're witnessing today. Tragically, today, we're seeing these horrific images every day. We're not shocked anymore. And of course, we're not feeling it. We don't have a draft. For Vietnam, there was a draft, and there was a possibility that your child could be drafted for a war in some far off hinterland that most Americans couldn't even point to on a map. As to enemies, is actually about weather engagements and in particular drone strikes. I have a student working on this, and most villages, most territories don't want terrorists in their midst. I've done a lot of work on the Chechens and the Caucasus, when terrorists come into a village, they're identifiable. Like I have a neighbor, I can tell if a new neighbor has moved into my neighborhood. And so her evidence shows, at least at the ground level, that some populations are grateful that terrorists are being plucked out, right? Because they don't want to be harmed in that way. On the other hand, that's at the very local individualized level. If you think about the broader story, the narrative that's been produced by the likes of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, right? And this anti-occupational, you could think about what they're doing is it's an anti-occupational sort of movement to say, get out of our territories for recruitment. And why so many sort of West Europeans joined the fight in ISIS in the Middle East was that they felt as if they needed to go help their brethren, their religious brethren, fight another occupational force and push them out. But paradoxically, at the individual level, we don't seem to be creating a lot of enemies. But what we are is creating these holistic narratives about sort of the bully, again, that bully idea of beating up from the sky 30,000 feet above, and there's no way to defend against that. And it's creating sort of an enemy in that way, an enemy mindset that we need to go help and do something about it.
Let me have two more questions on similar lines. Like, is it fair to say that that there was a fundamental shift in American interventionist thinking in the post-Iraq, post-Afghanistan context, or was the light footprint policy on Syria just an aberration? And second is, how do you believe that interventionist policy will be stunned out of good in the near future as the Cold War generation of policy makers are replaced by the millennials squad that cares more about domestic welfare priorities like universal healthcare than Pax Americana?
Those are great questions. So I do think they're in the post-Iraq. So when they're saying post-Iraq, are we talking about 1990 or 2003 or post-Afghanistan? I think I would hope that there has been a shift and that there is a shift, but it's not solidified yet. So there is a push. Now you do now have a debate about restrainers. So these are people who don't want to get versus engagers. 5 years ago, it was just a question of how engaged the United States was going to be and what proportion of that engagement were our allies. Now there's actually much more forceful argumentation that maybe we should pull back, not be isolationist, right? Not necessarily, we can't be isolationist. We're too embedded economically and other ways in the global community. And we're a big nation, right? So I do think that there is the possibility. Interestingly, we had more of a possibility of achieving that under the Trump administration than we do with the Biden administration, because as I alluded to before, Democrats do have strong impulses to go in and protect populations that are being harmed, right, with in humanitarian ways, genocide and repression and that kind of thing. And currently, we don't have the tools other than the use of force. We haven't honed those. So the big question is the extent to which the Biden administration is going to develop those trade, right? Back channel negotiations, two-tier diplomacy. And so keep an eye on that. And if they do that, then I would hope that the less use of force and the threat of use of force is going to follow suit. And on Syria, I don't think Syria was an aberration. We actually were involved in Syria. We drew red lines in the ground, and we were quite involved in Syria. In fact, we still have some troops there, in part because we're trying to balance Iraq and Iran. It's just that what we were trying to do is to get allies to do a little bit more lifting in Syria. But we also recognized that we had the Russian Federation sitting there, and we didn't want to get into a tete-a-tete with the Russian Federation. But to say that the United States wasn't involved in Syria, I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. The United States was engaged and still is engaged in Syria, not to the same extent, but in part because the conflict is going to be president and survive the war. So I wouldn't call Syria an aberration. I think we were engaged. The Obama administration was trying to allow others to take a more formidable role, just like in Libya, and we are still engaged. I think, and tragically, to some extent, the Russian Federation is much more engaged. They managed to gain a foothold because diplomatically and strategically, we didn't think about a long game there.
Let me again club three more questions. First is, like Professor, you said that US consider Russia and China as the first and second number enemies. So what is that US consider dangerous? What is that fear US? Is it the fear of losing democratic values that US believe in, or the territory that US possesses, or its interests abroad? How do US government and people take North Korea in this context? Is the government and the people on the same plane when it comes to North Korea? That is the first question. Second is, do you think US is intervening around for the protection of democracy? Because there are many evidences that US has intervened for the protection of dictators in the Middle East. Third is, how much has US benefited from foreign interventions, as the cost of interventions might be very high, very costly? So these are the two questions.
Yeah, so let me start with the third question. I'm not sure the US has benefited as much as it thinks it has, which is why I'm pursuing this project. And the costs, I mean, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost the country, some people say, multiple trillions, right? There was a book put out by Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes, who was my colleague at the Kennedy School. And when they put it out about the Iraq and Afghanistan, it was pretty much about Iraq. They called it the $1 trillion war, which was, or how they were able to get to that number is they included casualties, injuries, and in particular brain injuries with the improvised explosive devices. And you have young men and women who were in the prime of their life who survived the battlefield, but basically they're no longer in a position to be able to provide for themselves and their families and be productive members of society. And so they calculated a cost to support these veterans now who are no longer healthy, right? They have severe brain injuries. And so I'm not sure you could make the argument that these wars have been securing US vital national interests. When you think about the knock-on effect, which is the instability in Iraq, first of all, Afghanistan, we're still there. It's the longest conflict the United States has ever been involved in. And the knock-on effect is that you had a resurgence of violence in Iraq, gave rise to ISIS, lead to instability in Syria, that then led to a confrontation between the United States, direct confrontation between the United States and the Russian Federation. And the United States actually was on the losing side of that. Russian President Putin played that hand beautifully. And now Russia has sort of an even more secure toehold. So no, I'm not, and then you can think about Yemen and what that means for our national honor, in the sense that our weapons are being used to sort of kill Yemeni population. To what end, right? To help Saudi Arabia beat up on an insurgency in Yemen. And you're right in terms of intervening in the Middle East to help promote and support dictators. Look, states are going to do that if they believe that it's going to secure their national interest. And in some cases, the United States did this quite a bit. I showed you the guides of that. support or push down different dictators or autocrats because we felt it was going to support U.S. vital interests. In part to sort of counter the Soviet Union and communism and socialism. We stood for liberal capitalism. They stood for, there was a theory about dominoes falling. And so the United States made the calculation that in some cases, yes, they're all autocrats, they're all bad, but some are better than others, right? And so we're going to support those that we believe are better than us, not better for us, regardless of their ideas and ideology, because they're going to help support and secure U.S. vital interests. So and we're going to have to override humanitarian interests because in the longer term, if we can secure and make stable that country and get it into our wheelhouse, then perhaps later the rationale might be, and in some cases was, we'll secure humanitarian interests later. Let's just get that country. Other countries do that as well. I mean, Britain and France have gone along for the ride. So has Germany and NATO, right? So you're absolutely right. That, but you want to look at states and what they're trying to do is secure vital interests first, and it's great if they can secure humanitarian interests. Really, the only conflict that was truly to secure intervention in the modern era that was to secure humanitarian interests was Somalia. The United States did not have a vital interest in that conflict, and that one went really south. That was the time, first time that you had UN peacekeepers in the post-Cold War world where they were attacked, and then the United States sort of pulled back and handed this terrible conflict to the UN. And the US sort of learned a lesson there, which is maybe it's not in our interest to protect and promote humanitarian concerns first and foremost. Let's stick with national interests. Horrific, but that's not going to be our primary concern. And I mean, you can look at the European response to the war in Syria and the humanitarian crisis there with the population. A good portion of that population, I think, is 1 in 4 Syrians are on the road. And the Europeans, what was their reaction? Shut it down because they were afraid that their national interests, in particular the national unity within those countries, were going to be unbalanced if you had too many refugees and asylum seekers coming in. So states, they're going to secure their vital interests first, but they will also work if it's the case that they can secure humanitarian interests as well. And Libya, again, reinforced this idea. It was probably the most representative case of the responsibility to protect doctrine, where this is a new doctrine that was adopted and actually signed on by most states around the world, where states were to be held account if they were. That one went awry. That conflict went awry, that intervention. And so now that impulse for humanitarian engagement is even less. So you had Somalia that didn't work. That should have succeeded, failed in the 1990s. And then in the 2000s, Libya, responsibility to protect, had a UN Security Council resolution to go in there, and that too failed. So I hate to say the humanitarian impulse has been diminished quite substantially. Now, that may not be bad if it's the case that we can think about other ways to put pressures on states to behave, right? Sanction them, sanction the elites. Don't let their elites go to Oxford, Tufts, Harvard to be educated. Lock down their bank accounts. There's different tools that might be workable in order to prevent sort of the worst predations of these states on their populations.
Thank you, Professor. We still have lots of questions, but we're running out of time. So let me take 2 more sets of questions. First is, do you think China can emerge as a power that can compete with the US? If China emerges as a power that can challenge the US, will China be able to intervene the way US did in the past? Mm-hmm. Second is, how would you view US-China, India-China cooperation as effective in countering growing Chinese hegemony?
Mm-hmm. Great questions. So back to great power politics. Yes, I do think, there is a nervousness in the United States and policy circles about China. It's got a huge landmass. If you look traditionally at measures of power, it's huge landmass, extraordinarily large population, and it's got a number of interests, right, that it has overseas in its area. That the United States has agreed to defend, notably Taiwan, and to some extent Hong Kong. alliances, alliance partners, Japan and South Korea, that it's committed to defend, and China is sort of, growing, rising. We talk about rising hegemons as a power. And on top of that, just in terms of straight material power, China is a threat. Its economy is humming. It seems to have recovered well from the COVID pandemic. The United States is still struggling with it. Although that's temporary, right? You want to look, 5, 10, 20 years down the road. And China has a competing ideology, right? The United States holds itself up to be a democratic nation, transparent, accountable. I know that's been frayed a little bit from the last administration, but it is a democratic nation, and our democratic institutions, they held up, right? We had a relatively peaceful transfer of power to the new administration, whereas China is a one-party state, top down situation. And on top of that, I think what makes China even worrisome related to that is that in the current era, I already showed you those data from Ivan Aragin Toft about material power does not matter as much anymore, which is why people are nervous. And China is doing a beautiful job of harnessing sort of control in other ways. And you can think about cyber, right? China is really sort of doing a brilliant job in sort of controlling reality, right? And policies and norms and putting them out there and trying to compete with other states about what values and norms should be supported and advanced globally. And then, of course, its cyber capacity and its ability to do cyber intrusions. Iran and North Korea are right behind them there. And the United States seems to be on the defensive there, not on the offense. So when you think about material power, it's not necessarily going to be about material power. It's going to be about who controls the narrative, right, and can insert their views and their values into the system such that they gain control and perhaps sovereign control over other peoples and nations. And so China can compete. It shows it's competing, economically, diplomatically. Some states, autocratic states, like China's policy of non-intervention, right, especially over human rights affairs, and then the cyber issue. I'm trying to think. Oh, then India. Yeah, I think India could serve as a nice buttress. India is a democratic. Again, it's a huge country, large landmass, educated population, and they support democracy. And so it's a natural ally, oh, by the way, it also has nuclear weapons. Now, the problem is it's got an issue with Pakistan, and the United States doesn't want to get involved in that conflict. But it could potentially be a formidable ally as China continues to elite, keep the economy humming, right, such that the population is happy and you don't have an internal struggle and an internal revolution. It's a big question mark. We don't know the answer to that. By the way, that was the same question that was sort of troubling and dealing with the Soviet Union. And as you saw, the Soviet Union was a great power. It crumbled. China, don't forget, could crumble. We don't know if it's going to, but that's a big question, is about whether it can stay a formidable power.
Let me move to the next round of question. You said that states could support dictators if it serves its national interest. If that is true, would it be wrong to assume that US will stand for the protection of democracy in countries around the world? If it is wrong, is it wrong for Nepalese here to expect too much from US when it comes to protection of democracy?
Is it wrong to expect expectations? I do think the United States does stand for protecting of democracies and democratic rights and the individual, right? That's what democracy is all about, right? It's coming out of the Enlightenment where the people have a say. So I do think that there's always going to be a friend there. The question is whether the United States is willing to spill blood and treasure. And what I'm trying to do, and what I hope I can do, is say it doesn't have to be blood. It might be treasure, but it doesn't have to be blood. And so I'm hoping that the last 20 years, and that the Biden administration understands and recognizes that there's alternatives to that. And I think if we can get down that road and strengthen the alternatives, then I do think that the United States can be a more formidable ally, because then they're not worried about losing American troops and soldiers and that kind of thing. And also Nepalese populations, right? Along those lines. So I think that you don't have to make that ultimate sacrifice, which is putting American lives in harm's way. So if you can build up alternative tools of statecraft, I think that that's good news, not only for American citizens and troops, right, but also for the Nepalese and those fighting for democracy elsewhere around the world.
There are lots of interesting questions, but we are running out of time. So let me, I'll take some more time because we still have around 10 minutes. So like you said that US intervened for their allies, but it has also been seen that many times US has not intervened for its allies. So how do US decide when to intervene and where to intervene? Second is US attacked Iraq, stating that it has evidences of Iraq possessing harmful weapons, but it was not recovered. So what might have been the reason behind the attack?
The decision to intervene in a state is incredibly complex, and I can't give you a pat answer for that. Different administrations have different calculations, but like I said, it's always going to be with rare exceptions, and I talked about Somalia and Libya. Rare exceptions. Now, this doesn't involve sort of, getting involved after a natural disaster, right? So tsunamis and that kind of thing. We're talking about, real military uses of force. First and foremost is, does it serve or advance U.S. national interests? They don't have to be vital, but are they at least going to not harm U.S. national interests and hopefully advance them? And if that's the case, then the U.S. is likely to intervene. And if there's a humanitarian concern and that we can help sort of citizens within a state, and protect them in some way, just an administration make that difficult decision that yes, we need to intervene. So each administration is going to have to calculate based on each episode. And then, of course, what are the alliance interests? And then how is it going to destabilize the regional balance of power, which gets to the second question about Iraq. I mean, that was probably one of the worst foreign policy decisions an American government had ever made under the George W. Bush administration, was to go into Iraq. And as you know, students of history, it was a mixed set of reasons that they went in. Initially, it was because of the fear of yellow cake and nuclear weapons capacity, similar to what we're concerned about in Iran today. And then it became about sort of a dictator and humanitarian concerns. And that's really striking, because what did you see happening there? You saw a vital national interest. We did not want another state being nuclear armed, particularly in the Middle East, which is a very dangerous region of the world. And saying, oh my gosh, this man is a dictator. He's going to beat up and kill off a large part of his population. So you had the marrying of the national interest folks with the humanitarian concern folks. But it was a very, very complicated set of reasons the U.S. went in, and it changed over time. And I have to say, we're still paying the costs of that. Like, I've already gone through the history of it. We didn't finish, it distracted us from finishing off what was happening in Afghanistan and allowed that to fester. And then, of course, it gave rise and empowered Al-Qaeda. And then Al-Qaeda ends up splintering, and we ended up having ISIS. And we have the whole conflict today that we're still dealing with.
Thank you, Professor. Let me end with one more question today. How logical is it to have a war for peace? US has often attacked that has devastated countries and killed thousands. But the reason given was war for peace, war for regional security, and war for regional peace.
Yeah, it's such a great question, right? Because it seems like how can you negotiate those two? Look, I do think that there are some actors in the world that are nasty and not good. I mean, look at North Korea, this regime where you have a whole population that's basically brainwashed and malnourished. But the big question that always has to be asked is the use of force the best way to go? And what you want to do is you want to try diplomacy first, economics, but sometimes that's just not going to work. And the other side, the other state, doesn't believe that you're bluffing, or they think that you might be bluffing. And so that you have to threaten the use of force and then use force. I mean, I think you can go back to World War I, World War II. There were some nasty actors there. And had the United States not been involved in those two conflicts, you might have had an autocratic fascist Europe. So, again, you have to look and assess that peace is the more likely outcome, then I do think that you can have a war for peace. You know, I've studied civil wars. I've looked at, you know, settlements, and sometimes, you know, the other side just doesn't believe that it's not winning, or that it's losing. And the only way to sort of, you know, to sharpen their minds is you've got to have another confrontation, another battle to sort of get them to the battlefield, to press them, to push them. So, you know, I do think you can have a war for peace, but you got to do it smartly, and it needs to be last resort, right? It really does need to be last resort. And my concern is a nice way to end our conversation here is that it hasn't become last resort. And we need to go back and reflect on that and figure out how to do that.
Thank you, Professor Monica Toft. Thank you very much for the wonderful discussion. It was our privilege to have you with us. We learned a lot, and I'm sure all our participants also benefit from it. We still have lots of questions, but we have come to the end of the program. We are really grateful for your kind presence. We hope to see you in real in Nepal or maybe other parts of the world once things get normal. Wish you good health. We'd also like to thank all our participants for their presence and wonderful question. Professor Toft, have a nice day and good night to our friends in Asia.
Thank you very much. And if anybody wants to be in touch, just email me. You can find me at Tufts. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Professor.